Smoke you may see drifting up is incense, just in case anyone's wondering. I do burn quite a lot. It's very relaxing. I've come across a piece in the eye. I wasn't really intending this one to be a video, but I think it's relevant. It's topical nowadays, and I think it would make for a good video. I've made a few videos on the subject of policing in this country and my thoughts on where the police are now in terms of public trust. I've not been uncritical of the police, and I stand by every word I've said. But there is other angles to consider. I'm just going to read out this report without further ado. Then, as always, expand a bit with my own take on it. The report's in the Eye, the 23rd of April, and the report's by Cahal Milmo. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. Morale within ranks of Met Police has hit rock bottom. Morale within the Metropolitan Police is at rock bottom as pressure mounts on Britain's largest force over its handling of pro-Palestinian protests, insiders have warned. Serving and former Scotland Yard officers raised questions about the toll being taken on frontline personnel from policing the protests, saying that staff faced having their leave cancelled and were being left unable to carry out their normal job of patrolling London's boroughs. The Metropolitan Police Federation, which represents rank-and-file staff, said officers were being asked to do a near-impossible job during the protests and found themselves liable to trial by social media, where they had been required to act spontaneously with no benefit of hindsight. The MPF said the burden of policing the central London protests was having a knock-on effect on the service provided elsewhere in the capital. In January, the Yard revealed that policing pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli marches had cost it £26.5 million since the Hamas massacres on the 7th of October 2023. £26.5 million for policing one series of protests. The MPF said every weekend Metropolitan Police officers are having their leave and days off cancelled to facilitate these protests, while their normal job patrolling the local boroughs is just not getting done. While the protests we have seen are in the main peaceful, the constant criticism and the trial by social media our officers suffer while we're policing them is unfair to hard-working police officers. Our colleagues on the front line are in a near impossible job. Damned if we do, damned if we don't, while trying to keep London moving and keep people safe. Insiders at the Yard, whose leaders include Chief Sir Mark Rowley, have faced months of criticism over issues including the handling of the anti-war protests related to Gaza and broader questions over professional standards within the force, said the latest dispute had damaged already low morale. One former officer said things are at absolute rock bottom in terms of morale. There is no doubt that the wrong words were used in the case of Mr. Gideon Falter. I'll come back to that because it's important as a talking point, that is. But the pressures officers are working under are immense. There are not just the resources available to police these protests and get the day job done at the same time. There's a very strong sense that you're permanently only a hair's breadth from social media pylon just for doing your job, and that has a very real effect on people's willingness to do that job. Police chiefs have repeatedly emphasised that they have an obligation to facilitate peaceful protests amid a global outcry over the deteriorating situation in Gaza, humanitarian situation in Gaza. But the demonstrations have at the same time become a touchstone for complaints from some politicians and campaigners over what they say is a lenient attitude to hate speech from some taking part in the marches. Nearly a third of officers intend to resign from the force within the next 2 years or as soon as they can. The same edition has a piece on, well, there's two other pieces. Met needs to rebuild people's trust, Prime Minister says. And there's also a piece featuring Sadiq Khan. There's a few pieces actually by the editor Simon Kellner on the exchange of Gideon Falter. I'll come back to that. And also on Sadiq Khan's approach to restoring public trust in policing, particularly around safety of women. Okay, there's a lot to digest there. Let me just say for the record, I don't envy the job police have. I really do think they have a very difficult job, particularly in bigger forces like the Metropolitan Police in any urban area, but particularly in London, because London more than any other city gets through sort of large scale protests. Um, and naturally being the capital, it is also the target more than anywhere else for terrorism and all the things that come with that. So I do not think it is easy being a Metropolitan Police officer. That's why I've got no issue with any sort of pay rise. However, um, my sympathy only goes to an extent because I think a lot of the controversies the police have faced are entirely of their own making. Now, they say it's trial by social media. And we know that we live in an era where things get immediately put on video, put online, things can be taken out of context. And in fact, the Gideon Falter exchange may be a good example of this. I was going to make a specific video on that, but maybe I'll just touch on it on this one. If you don't know the background, Gideon Falter is a Jewish man. He's a campaigner against anti Semitism. And he was involved in an exchange with a Metropolitan Police officer, um, and he says he was just going for a stroll. He'd been to the synagogue. He was just going for a stroll. The officer said, "Sir, you look visibly Jewish." And the implication the officer was giving was, if you go through, there'll be trouble. We're kind of protecting you through, we're holding you back for your own safety. And if you continue, you'll be arrested. Now, initially, I'll be honest, I thought this is outrageous. This man's going about his business. He's basically been told he has to go elsewhere to facilitate the protesters. But honestly, looking at it again and looking at an interview between both Mr. Falter and a representative of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, and Mr. Jamal, this was on Sky News, I believe. I'll try and put a link if I can. Although I may make a specific video about this one because it's a good case in point. There may be more to it. I think it was a clumsy choice of words by the officer. You look visibly Jewish, because you can imagine like saying to a Muslim hijabi woman, ma'am, you look, we wouldn't say that in this country, madam, you look visibly Muslim, stay away from the CDL march. That would not go down well. Um, and even if he was being it was for his own safety, that is still in of itself a bad message. That, the implication would be if he went there, he wouldn't be. Now, I don't know if that, he says he was going for a stroll. Mr. Jamal says actually he and his group was constantly there as counter protesters. Maybe not him personally, but his group, the campaign against anti-Semitism. So it's a war of words. Interestingly, the officer hasn't been disciplined. Sir Mark Rowley stood by him, but there has been heavy criticism of the incident. The Daily Mail was, all over it, obviously. I suspect there may be more to this. I'm not sure that Mr. Falter's quite as, I was going to say innocent, even if he was there as a counter protest, that doesn't make him guilty. But was he really just strolling, or was he going to try and, you know, get attention in his exchange with the officer? It's hard to know. I think there's a lot of angles to that. I may make a separate video on it. But getting back to the point of this video, I don't think it would be fun being a Metropolitan Police officer these days. They are criticised across the board. They're criticised for internal racism. They're criticised for misogyny. I certainly think that the backlash from what happened with Wayne Couzens, and then David Carrick, it's certainly done them no favours. And then the way they, arrested women who were protesting about them, it just was bad optics. Um, and with these Palestinian marches, it's it's a difficult thing because on one hand there is a right to peaceful protests, and most of the protests have been peaceful. But when I say I've limited sympathy, it's because there's two things. There's a practical thing, right? So it may well be that in recent months they haven't been able to respond to burglaries and other crimes because they have had to put resources into this. Okay, that is something that it's a challenge for them, and I am sympathetic in that regard. However, there's other areas I think it's just a lack of common sense. In that regard, I have no sympathy. That's not from a lack of resources. That's not from a lack of political backing. That really is just from the police themselves making foolish decisions. I don't think they can say, oh, we have our hands tied when they're making foolish decisions. For example, not being consistent in policing. When you have officers, for example, and granted in that case, she wasn't even a community support officer, she was some sort of liaison, but telling a gospel singer, singing outside a church, you cannot do that. And yes, the Metropolitan Police apologised, but coming down hard on something like that, yeah, you have jihadists on the street. And the police response is, we'll look into it. I do think there's a real perception out there that the police are not consistent. And frankly, I think they've brought that on themselves because they have told Jewish people, take down posters of the hostages in Gaza, but they have, there's unquestionably been pro-Hamas placards. Now, the police did step up a bit after criticism, um, but can they honestly say we have actively, you know, um, taken on everyone who's displayed signs of extremism or displaying signs of troublemaking? I don't think they can honestly say that. I do think that with the police, they're sometimes an easy target. So if they're policing, a group of pro-Palestinians who usually outnumber the pro-Israelis, the easier target will be Jewish counter-protesters. Um, I do think the police sometimes will take the easier target. I'm not saying their job is easy. It's not. But another example is, someone flies the England flag or the UK flag in their front yard, and they're immediately, rebuked by the police, and immediately resources are put into that. But again, early in these protests, you had people basically shouting for jihad on the streets of Britain, and the police done nothing. They said, we'll look into it. So I appreciate that officers are under a lot of criticism and under a lot of pressure, but I also think they have to acknowledge that they haven't entirely helped things themselves. I think, I would say they should improve training, but so much of this just comes down to common sense. Individual officers shouldn't be so detached from basic common sense that they cannot see how something will go down with public opinion. I'm very, very sympathetic to officers who are really trying to diffuse a situation, and they're saying, look, so in the case of Mr. Falter, it may well be that he was just being difficult. Like maybe he could have just went another route and been escorted safely. And he would argue the principle is that he shouldn't have to, and he would be right about that. But a few weeks ago, no, about last week actually, I was going through my local bus terminus and clearly something was going on, and the police asked people to move around. Now, I didn't say, oh, they're infringing on my rights. I want to go this way. I assumed, okay, something's happened. There's a serious crime incident. They want to secure the area. It wasn't a major inconvenience for me. It added about half a minute to my journey time. Um, and the officer was polite about it. So I'm not going to make a thing of that. I do think sometimes people will make police officers' job difficult. But then there's other occasions where officers overstep the mark and they are not consistent. Another example is on British Transport Police. The case I would cite is with Brenda Kavanagh, the pianist. I've mentioned this case a few times. I think it's important. The policewoman in that case, with British Transport Police, instead of going in there in a neutral way and saying, okay, you have two parties, you have the pianist on one side and the Chinese nationals on the other, let's hear what happened, she immediately took it on herself to badger him and harass him and tell him he can't say things. She didn't say a word to the young Chinese guy who had yelled in his face, and exacerbated the situation. She didn't say anything to them about, in the UK, you have to respect that this is a free space. He has a right to do that. So I would cite that as an example of appalling policing. Um, I I am sympathetic to the police to an extent, insofar as sometimes I think the criticism is unfair. There are times where they are kind of what's that expression, there's a word for it. I forget off the top of my head, but it may well be that sometimes they're on the front line, they're the first to be criticised. It's a little bit like, if I could draw a very loose analogy, waiters in a restaurant, if there's something wrong with the food, the chef never gets directly criticised. The customers will complain to the waiters. The waiters get all the heat from everyone. Likewise, police are on the front line. They will get criticised if they seem to be inconsistent, if they're crossing a line, if they're not doing enough. Yes, they do get a lot of criticism, and that cannot be easy to be in a job and that your profession's constantly being criticised. But frankly, they cannot complain too much because some of this is entirely of their own making. I mean, with the Wayne Couzens thing, you cannot tell me that that guy and other misogynistic thugs in the force done what they done and there was complete ignorance about it in the ranks. That tells us that there were officers who were turning a blind eye to this. You know, the fact that those guys got away with it for so long, um, you know, there's also been exposes of Snapchats and social media messages, officers sharing stuff. They can't complain that's bad PR. They can't say, "Oh, we've got a low morale because we've been caught out." I'm sorry, I have no sympathy in that regard. I think such officers, for example, joking about rape victims, they don't deserve to wear a uniform. Um, so my sympathy goes to an extent. It goes so far as I appreciate it's not an easy job. It goes so far as I think there's times the police are doing their level best and they'll get criticised anyway. You know, I will always support the police when they're apprehending dangerous criminals. I will always support them when they have to make instant decisions that may not be easy. Um, I will not support them when they're abusing their power. I will not support them when they're not being consistent because that demonstrates a bias in policing. It's an incredibly important thing because if they're perceived to be going easy on one group of people, but then cracking down on another because maybe they deem them to be easier, you know, a softer target, that is going to destroy public trust. There's been far too many examples of people feeling that they have crossed the line. The woman who was held on Coronation Day, all day basically, 8 hours she was held, and she'd done nothing wrong. She was falsely perceived to be part of Just Stop Oil, but even when she proved that she wasn't, they still held her. Now, the Met said that was another force that took her in Lincolnshire, but you know, it would still have been the Metropolitan Police that questioned her all that time. Too many cases like that are happening, and I don't think it's good enough to say, oh, can the public just be understanding? Civil liberties are not a trivial thing. The public do have rights, and the police have to remember this. I think also there's times the police themselves don't seem to know the law. That's concerning. And it's why whenever there is new legislation, for example, on hate crime, it's so important that it's clear what that involves. Because if the police themselves don't know, if the public don't know, then that is rife for abuse of power. It's rife for people being implicated simply for holding a strong opinion. Anyway, I'll wrap this up, but I've mixed feelings on this one. I do think it's a difficult profession, and officers sometimes do take very real risks. But I also think they have to accept that a lot of the criticism is valid, and they have brought this on themselves. You know, they cannot say that with what happened with Wayne Couzens and David Carrick, and I don't think they're the only ones. They were extreme examples. But they can't say, oh, well, it's not fair that we have this reputation as misogynists when that sort of culture was allowed to thrive. Um, you know, so the police have to accept that this isn't all some, you know, sort of witch hunt or just the media trying to sell papers or something. A lot of this is entirely their own fault. They have to accept that. And if they're not willing to accept that, then the public aren't going to believe that they're really reforming. This is the important thing. At the same time, I think the public need to be understanding that they are in a difficult job and, yeah, be understanding of that. But understanding doesn't mean that we just say, okay, well, it's fine if they violate civil liberties. That's somehow a trivial thing. It's not. There's no excuse for that, especially when you have a situation where they may have suspected someone of something. Fine, bring them in, question them. But once it is established that that person is innocent, they should be released. I'm talking about the woman apprehended on Coronation Day last year, um, and she's done nothing wrong, you know, or policing where you have soft targets like the gospel singer. There's no excuse for that. And I don't think it's enough to just say sorry. I think the individual officers who cross a line have to be disciplined. And in the worst cases, they should lose their job, frankly, because they should not be wearing a uniform. No, I rephrase that. In the worst cases, they should be arrested. If they've crossed the line to the point where they've assaulted an innocent person, they should be arrested. Police officers should not be above the law. So, just to conclude, I don't envy the position they're in. I think it's a difficult job. Police officers do a lot to keep people safe, and there are individuals who do incredibly brave things. I give them credit for that. But I don't accept that all criticism of the police is just some sort of social media witch hunt. I think there is a basis for it. I think the police need to accept that. And a lot of the criticism as well is deserved. One last thing I'll say: I've sometimes seen people comment on social media about this. Oh well, if you criticise the police, feel free to take on crime yourself. That's a ridiculous argument because if people take things into their own hand, then they'll be criminally liable. So it's ridiculous saying, "Oh, who do you call when you have a problem?" That's ridiculous expecting the public to say, "Well, either just shut up and never criticize the police, or never use the police," because the public have no choice but to contact the police. The police themselves are always saying, you need to report crime. Well, when the public do, it's reasonable that they expect a response. I think with the pro-Palestinian stuff, I think the police need to come down hard on anyone showing sympathy to Hamas or showing anti-Semitic signs. Um, yes, freedom of assembly is a right, but how long is this going to go on? I mean, is it going to be protest day in and day out? Conflict goes on, and why not have that for every conflict? Um, because it is taking away resources from other situations. If someone has their house burgled in Havering or Redbridge, and you have police in central London policing the pro-Palestinian marches, that is having a detrimental effect on Londoners, particularly in the outer boroughs. I have huge sympathy for them. So when it comes to the police, I try and keep an open mind. I try to be understanding. I know they have a difficult job. And my personal dealings with the police has mostly been good. I've dealt with a few officers over the years who didn't, were unprofessional, but for the most part, it's been good. But yeah, they have to accept that this criticism is not a witch hunt. A lot of it has basis.